Elvis Presley was known for a lot of things: his voice, his movies, the way he moved on stage. But people who worked around him closely, his staff, his security team, the people who traveled with him, often said something that rarely made it into the books and documentaries. They said Elvis was one of the calmest men they had ever been around in a tense situation. That might seem surprising. He was one of the most recognized people on the planet for nearly 2 decades. He sold out arenas. He had screaming crowds following his every move. That level of attention can change a person. It can make someone paranoid, short-tempered, or difficult to be around. But the people closest to Elvis described the man who, in most situations, kept his composure. He was polite with strangers. He was patient with his staff. He did not raise his voice without reason. That does not mean he was a pushover. The people who knew him well were clear about that too. Elvis had grown up without money, in a part of the country where life was hard and people did not get far by being soft. He had worked for everything he had. He understood what it meant to be in a room where someone did not respect you, and he had learned how to handle it without losing control. By the time he reached the peak of his fame in the late 1960s and through the 1970s, Elvis had been in the public eye for well over a decade. He had dealt with critics who said he would never last. He had dealt with the press, with Hollywood, with the military, and with the music industry that did not always treat him fairly. He had also dealt with people, fans, strangers, and sometimes people closer to him who tested his patience or his reputation. Most of those moments stayed private. Elvis did not talk about them in interviews. His team did not leak stories to the press. What happened behind closed doors mostly stayed there, but some incidents were witnessed by enough people that they could not stay quiet forever. Over the years, those who were present started talking, not to cause trouble, but because they felt the story said something true about who Elvis really was. One incident in particular stood out. It was a moment where someone walked up to Elvis Presley, not in private, not in a back room, but in front of other people, and made a direct threat. They said something that was meant to intimidate him. They wanted Elvis to feel uncomfortable, to back down, or to show some sign that the words had landed. What happened next was not what anyone expected. Elvis did not walk away. He did not call for his security team. He did not get loud or aggressive. He handled it in a way that left the people in the room quietly stunned. Some of them said afterward that it was one of the most composed things they had ever seen a man do in that kind of situation. Others said it told them more about Elvis Presley in 30 seconds than anything they had read about him. This video is going to walk through that story from beginning to end. We will look at who the person was that made the threat, what their connection to Elvis's world was, and what had been going on in the background that led to the confrontation. We will look at the moment itself, where it happened, what was said, and how Elvis responded. And we will look at what came after, including what the witnesses said when they eventually talked about it. The reason this story matters is not because it is dramatic. It's not a story about violence or scandal. It's a story about character, about how a man who had every reason to rely on his fame, his money, or his security team to deal with a threat chose instead to handle it himself, quietly, directly, and without making a scene. That's the part of Elvis Presley that did not always make it into the public image. The image was the sequined jumpsuits, the hit records, the sold-out shows in Las Vegas. But underneath all of that was a man from Tupelo, Mississippi, who had been tested long before he was famous, and who never quite forgot where he came from. What happened the day someone threatened him in front of everyone starts with understanding that background, and it starts with understanding the specific situation that brought two very different people into the same room at the wrong moment. To understand what happened that day, you have to go back a little. Not years, but enough time to see how the situation developed. Confrontations like this one rarely come out of nowhere. There is usually a chain of events, a buildup of tension, and a point where one person decides they have had enough. That is what happened here. The incident took place during the period when Elvis was doing regular concert tours across the United States. By the early 1970s, Elvis had returned to live performing after nearly a decade away from the stage. His 1969 run in Las Vegas had been a major success, and from that point forward, touring became a central part of his life. He was on the road frequently, performing in cities large and small, moving from venue to venue with a large team around him. That team included musicians, backup singers, sound technicians, road managers, and security personnel. It was a big operation. Dozens of people traveled with Elvis or were involved in putting his shows together at each stop. And like any large operation, it came with its share of personalities, disagreements, and tensions that had to be managed carefully. The man who made the threat was not a stranger off the street. He was someone connected to the entertainment and venue world, a local promoter and venue manager who had been involved in organizing one of Elvis's stops on a particular tour. His name was Mike Stone in some accounts, though the specific identity has varied across different tellings of events from that period. What is consistent across the accounts is the nature of the man's grievance and the way he chose to express it. The issue had to do with money and control. Promoters who worked with Elvis's management, specifically with Colonel Tom Parker, sometimes found the business arrangements frustrating. Colonel Parker ran Elvis's career with an iron grip. He negotiated contracts, controlled access, and made decisions about how shows were structured and what each party received from the arrangement. Not everyone who dealt with Parker came away satisfied. Some felt they had been given terms that were not fair. Some felt they had been pushed aside or treated as less important than they were. This particular individual had come away from his dealings with Parker's team feeling that he had been shortchanged. There was a dispute over the financial terms of the venue agreement. He believed he was owed more than he had received, or that the terms had been changed without his full agreement. The details of the financial dispute were not unusual for the touring business of that era. What was unusual was what he decided to do about it. Rather than taking the matter through the proper channels, through lawyers, through management, through a formal complaint, he decided to confront Elvis directly. This was a significant miscalculation. Elvis was not involved in the financial negotiations of his tours. That was Colonel Parker's domain. Elvis showed up, performed, and trusted his management to handle the business side. He was largely kept away from the contract details, which was a pattern throughout his career. Parker preferred it that way, and Elvis, for much of his life, accepted that arrangement. So when this man decided to bring his grievance to Elvis personally, he was already directing his anger at the wrong person. But beyond that miscalculation, there was something else at work. This man had convinced himself that Elvis's fame and the size of his entourage meant that Elvis would not respond strongly to a direct challenge. He may have assumed that a music star, surrounded by handlers and used to being managed, would simply step back and let someone else deal with the situation. He had also chosen his moment carefully, or so he thought. He approached Elvis at a point when there were other people present, staff members, a few crew, some people connected to the venue. It was not a packed room, but there were enough witnesses that whatever happened would be seen. That seemed to be part of the intention. He wanted an audience. He wanted Elvis to feel the weight of being called out in front of others. What he did not fully account for was who Elvis Presley actually was when the performance was over and the lights were off. Not the entertainer, not the celebrity, the man from Tupelo who had spent his whole life learning how to stand his ground without losing himself in the process. That is the man he was about to meet. The moment itself did not begin with shouting. That is the first thing worth understanding. People who were present said it started quietly, the way most serious confrontations do when one person has made up their mind about what they are going to say and the other person has no idea what is coming. Elvis had finished a meeting with some of his road crew and was moving through a backstage corridor at the venue. It was the kind of routine movement that happened dozens of times during any tour stop, walking from one area to another, exchanging a few words with staff, staying focused on the evening ahead. The people around him were used to this rhythm. Nobody was on edge. It was an ordinary moment in what had become a very structured daily routine on the road. That is when the man stepped forward. He positioned himself directly in Elvis's path, not off to the side, not at a distance, directly in front of him. The people with him noticed immediately. There was something in the man's posture and expression that signaled this was not someone coming to ask for an autograph or pass along a message from the venue. He was there with a purpose, and it was not a friendly one. He spoke loudly enough that the people nearby could hear every word. He brought up the financial dispute, the money he believed he was owed, the way he felt he had been treated by Elvis's management team. He was direct and aggressive in his language. And then he crossed the line that changed the nature of the conversation entirely. He made a threat, not vague or implied, but stated plainly. He told Elvis that if the situation was not resolved the way he wanted, there would be consequences. The exact wording has been described in slightly different ways by those who recalled it, but the meaning was consistent across every account. It was a threat, delivered face to face, in front of witnesses. The people standing nearby froze. One of Elvis's security men took a step forward instinctively. A crew member later said his first thought was that the situation was about to turn physical and that they needed to get between the two men. There was a brief moment, just a few seconds, where nobody was sure what was going to happen next. Elvis did not step back. He did not look to his security team. He did not raise his voice or match the aggression of the man. He stood still, looked directly at the man, and waited for him to finish. He let him say everything he had come to say without interrupting him. That alone was notable. Most people, when confronted suddenly and aggressively, either respond immediately or physically withdraw. Elvis did neither. He simply waited. When the man finished speaking, Elvis responded calmly. He acknowledged that he had heard what was said. He made clear, without any uncertainty in his voice, that he was not going to be threatened. He told the man that if he had a genuine business dispute, there was a proper way to handle it and the right people to speak with, and that he, Elvis, was not one of those people when it came to contract matters. He said this without apology and without hesitation. Then he said something that the witnesses remembered clearly. He told the man that he understood he was frustrated, that he was not going to stand there and argue about money he had no direct involvement in, but that the way the man had chosen to bring this forward, in a corridor, in front of people, with a threat attached, was not something he was going to respond to the way the man seemed to be hoping. He was not going to be pushed, and he was not going to pretend the threat had not been made. Then he looked at one of his senior security staff and, in a level voice, told him to make sure the man did not have further access to the backstage area. No anger, no dramatics, just a clear, final instruction. The man stood there for a moment. Whatever reaction he had been expecting, this was not it. The security team moved in and guided him away from the corridor. Elvis watched him go, then turned back to the people he had been walking with and continued moving toward where he needed to be. One of the crew members who was present said afterward that what struck him most was not what Elvis said, it was how he looked during the whole thing. Steady, like someone who had been in difficult rooms before and knew exactly how to be in one. After the man was escorted away from the backstage area, the corridor settled back into its normal rhythm. People went back to what they had been doing. The evening schedule moved forward. Elvis continued his preparations for the show, and by all accounts, he did not bring up what had just happened with the people around him. He did not replay it, did not ask for opinions on how he had handled it, and did not seem to carry it with him into the rest of the day. That in itself told the people who had witnessed the confrontation something important. A lot of men, after being threatened openly in front of colleagues, would have needed time to process it. They would have talked about it, expressed frustration, or at minimum, shown some sign that it had affected them. Elvis moved past it almost immediately, not because he was indifferent, but because he had already handled it. In his mind, the matter was closed. The man who had made the threat did not return to the backstage area that day. The security team made sure of that. What happened to his specific business dispute with Colonel Parker's management operation is not fully documented in the accounts from people who were present. What is known is that it did not escalate further in any significant way. The confrontation in the corridor appears to have been the end of it, at least as far as Elvis's immediate world was concerned. Whether the financial grievance was ever formally resolved through other channels is something the available accounts do not clarify. What the witnesses did talk about in the years that followed was Elvis's behavior during and after the incident. Several people who had been present gave accounts that were consistent in their key details. They all noted the same things. The stillness he showed when the man first approached, the fact that he did not look to anyone else for support or backup during the confrontation itself, the calm, direct way he spoke, and the speed with which he returned to normal afterward. One member of Elvis's road crew, speaking in a later interview, said that the incident changed how he thought about Elvis as a person. He said that before that day, he respected Elvis as a performer and found him easy to work with. But seeing him handle that confrontation gave him a different kind of respect. He said it was the kind of composure you could not fake, and that it did not come from training or from having security nearby. It came from somewhere inside the man. That observation points to something worth examining. By the 1970s, Elvis had been surrounded by protection and support for many years. He had a security team, a management structure, and the group of loyal associates who had been with him for a long time. It would have been easy and completely understandable for a man in his position to rely entirely on that structure when a difficult moment arose, to step back, let the security team handle it, and remove himself from the situation. He did not do that. He stood where he was, handled the confrontation himself, and only involved his security team after the matter had already been resolved on his own terms. That choice said something about how he saw himself, not as someone who needed to be protected from a hard conversation, but as someone capable of managing one directly. It also reflected something about his upbringing that never fully left him, regardless of how famous or wealthy he became. Elvis had grown up in circumstances where backing down from a genuine challenge was not an option, not because the people around him were violent or because his environment was extreme, but because the culture he came from placed real value on personal dignity and standing your ground. You dealt with things yourself when you could. You did not look for someone else to fight your battles. That value showed up throughout his life in various ways. People who worked with him over the years noted that he could be generous to a fault, patient in situations that would have frustrated most people, and genuinely kind with strangers and fans. But they also noted that there was a line. And when someone crossed it, especially publicly, especially in a way that was meant to diminish him, Elvis did not pretend it hadn't happened. What the confrontation in that backstage corridor ultimately reveals is not something dramatic or complicated. It reveals a man who had a clear sense of who he was, and who did not need the crowd or the cameras or the applause to maintain that sense. The stage was where Elvis Presley performed, but the corridor that day showed who he actually was when the performance wasn't part of the equation. That is the part of his story that doesn't always get told, and it is the part that the people who were there never forgot.